For the ROK, this comes as a clear and present demonstration of the existential threat. One of the missiles flew 460 kilometers, exactly the same distance between Wonsan, a typical DPRK missile launch site, and Busan, the largest port city of the ROK. From the ROK standpoint, it amounts to a simulated attack. And as these launches provide valuable technical and military insights to the DPRK, it can be further encouraged to export ballistic missiles to other countries and rake in new revenue to further finance its illegal nuclear and ballistic missile programs. The DPRK missiles used in Ukraine are posing new challenges that require our joint response. My delegation calls on all Council members to make an extraordinary effort to curb the DPRK's provocations and its nuclear programs. The Security Council's inaction to date has only emboldened the Pyongyang regime, and continued inaction would further embolden it. As such, we need to rein in the unbridled offender before it is too late. The only thing necessary for the bad to triumph is for the good to do nothing. At the same time, all member states must fully implement relevant Security Council resolutions. In particular, we urge Russia to stop its military cooperation with the DPRK. Mr. President, turning again to Ukraine, my delegation once again urges the Russian Federation, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, entrusted as one of the exclusive ultimate guardians of world peace, to immediately withdraw its military forces from the territory of Ukraine and end the untold humanitarian suffering that this illegal war has caused. Currently, approximately 17.6 million Ukrainian people are in need of humanitarian assistance, with those near the front lines exposed to an even more dire situation, including acute food shortages. The war has created millions of internally displaced people and refugees around the globe. The deteriorating humanitarian situation and mass displacement increased risks of sexual violence and trafficking, especially for women and girls. In concluding, my delegation expresses our solidarity with Ukraine in fighting for its sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. In this connection, we will maintain our support for Ukraine in the areas of security, humanitarian affairs, and reconstruction, as President Yoon Suk-yeol announced during his visit to Ukraine in July. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I thank Undersecretary General De Carlo and Director Wasonu for their briefings today. Amid New Year's celebrations elsewhere, Ukrainians entered this new year in darkness, without heating, without shelter, and with air raid sirens ringing. 90 drones were fired at Odessa, Lviv, and other cities on New Year's Eve. Another massive assault took place on Monday, as temperatures across Ukraine dropped as low as -20. Over 1,000 towns and villages in 9 regions were left without power. Responders are rapidly making repairs, and I do not doubt the resilience and the determination of Ukrainians to defend their freedom and their territory. But these attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure must stop. In addition, Russia's use of ballistic missiles from the DPRK is a sign of recklessness and desperation. it violates multiple resolutions. All UN members have an obligation to implement UN resolutions. So I call on Russia, a P5 country, to halt its trading in arms with the DPRK and to implement all UNSC resolutions in full, and to restate its commitment to the global non-proliferation regime. I also call on Iran, the DPRK, and any third party that is providing material support to the Russian war machine to stop immediately. Ending Russia's access to foreign weapons will help end this war. Now, more specifically, President, near the front lines in Ukraine, the situation is even worse. The UN's humanitarian need and response plan for 2024 refers to entire communities pummeled daily, regions where no hospital or clinic has been left untouched by war. People have been without water and gas in their homes for over a year now. As we heard from OCHA, over 14.6 million people, about 40% of the Ukrainian population living in Ukraine, will need humanitarian assistance in 2024. The UK has committed £347 million in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and the region since 2022, and our support will continue. But as I heard during my visit to Kyiv, Russia continues to impede humanitarian access for millions of people living in the temporarily controlled territories. Civilians are struggling to access water, food, shelter, and other essential services. And the situation is expected to get worse as the cold weather intensifies. So Russia must, as this Council has said repeatedly, allow humanitarian organisations safe and unimpeded access to these areas immediately. Mr. President, New Year is a time for resolutions. We suggest Russia make 3: to abide by the UN Charter and Council resolutions, to stop its attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, and to withdraw its military from Ukrainian soil. Thank you, President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General, and Ms. Adam Wuzorn, Director of Operation and Advocacy of the Office of the Coordination, for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, for their insights shared with us today. Mr. President, the conflict in Ukraine is still having a serious negative impact on people's lives, destroying vital civilian infrastructure and means of subsistence, forcing civilians to flee their frontline village and increasing the need for humanitarian aid. It remains a major source of volatility in an already fragile world. Mr. President, it is said that conflict continues to be a major factor in the worldwide humanitarian crisis. The circumstances in Ukraine are a part of this alarming and catastrophic pattern. Therefore, we must safeguard citizens as well as the infrastructure necessary for their survival. Humanitarian assistance and protection, alongside the protection of civilians, are interlinked, complementary, and mutually reinforcing notions in the context of any conflict. We would like to remind all parties of their respective obligation to uphold, safeguard, protect, and provide for the fundamental needs of civilians, populations, as well as to strictly adhere to the relevant international humanitarian law. The protection of civilians is the cornerstone of international humanitarian law. Therefore, the principle of distinction, precaution, and proportionality must be scrupulously observed by all parties. Mr. President, while underscoring the importance of humanitarian assistance and protection to alleviate human suffering, we hold the view that it cannot be seen as a solution in itself. In our humble perspective, resolving the conflict is the most viable approach to deal with this humanitarian issue. In light of this, Mozambique encouraged the use of diplomacy and political negotiation to end the conflict as a first step towards a stable, long-lasting peace. For that desirable purpose, and as we have repeatedly advocated in this chamber, we call upon the parties for the cessation of hostilities and the resumption of direct negotiation to resolve the underlying issues. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland. Thank you, President. First of all, I would like to thank USG De Carlo and OCHA Advocacy Director Edem Wuzonu for their briefings, even though they were rather gloomy. I also welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine, as well as the representatives of other delegations. 160 years ago, Henri Dunant of Geneva, marked by the horror of the battlefield of Solferino, provided the impetus for the development of modern international humanitarian law. 75 years ago, the international community, scarred by the horrors of the Second World War, adopted the 4 Geneva Conventions, reinforcing the protection of civilians. This right must always be respected by all parties to an armed conflict. Yet, just 2 weeks ago, Russia launched one of the heaviest waves of missile and drone attacks on populated areas since the beginning of the military aggression. These attacks have not only claimed civilian lives, but have also destroyed homes and civilian infrastructure. Added to this are the enormous humanitarian needs and freezing temperatures. As Denise Brown, humanitarian coordinator for Ukraine, put it, for the Ukrainian people, the new year has begun in loss, pain, and anguish. One look at Ukraine and at conflicts throughout the world should be enough to convince us of the urgent need to reaffirm one of the fundamental principles of the Geneva Conventions. Civilians must neither be targeted nor subjected to indiscriminate attacks. Switzerland calls on all parties to the conflict to strictly respect international humanitarian law in all circumstances and in all places. President, the enormous humanitarian needs in Ukraine continue to grow. Solidarity from the international community is needed, and it can make a difference. For instance, the support provided last winter, including the donation of generators, made residents and internally displaced persons less vulnerable to the cold. Investments in repairs and maintenance have strengthened infrastructure in the face of attacks. Switzerland has contributed and continues to contribute to the resilience of Ukraine's energy infrastructure and population with its winter aid program, worth almost $100 million. On the 15th of January, the joint launch of the humanitarian and regional response plans in 2024 will take place in Geneva. It is essential that these 2 plans receive adequate financial resources. Responding to humanitarian needs is necessary, but it is not a long-term solution. What is really needed is for Russia to finally begin de-escalation. We call on it to cease all combat operations and to withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory without delay. The recent exchange of prisoners is a positive, albeit insufficient, step. Like the Secretary-General, we hope that further de-escalation initiatives will follow. Another constructive step was taken last May, with the 5 principles for protecting the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and avoiding a nuclear accident. In view of the Russian strikes in the vicinity of the nuclear plant, we need to remind ourselves of these principles. Above all, it is essential that the International Atomic Energy Agency has access to the entire site. De-escalation is all the more urgent as the global consequences of this war persist. Russia's decision to withdraw from the Black Sea Initiative jeopardizes food security far beyond Ukraine. President, after almost 2 years of war, peace is urgently needed. As such, we look forward to hosting a discussion as part of the Ukrainian peace formula in Davos on the 14th of January. By organizing this meeting, Switzerland is helping to support discussions aimed at achieving a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Thank you. I thank the representative of Switzerland for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Ms. DiCarlo and Ms. Wilson for their briefings and insights. Japan is gravely concerned over the intensified strikes and hostilities by Russia against Ukraine since the end of December. Many civilians have lost their lives or been injured. These attacks by Russia are leaving hundreds of thousands of people without electricity and water during the severe winter. According to the WHO, at least 10 healthcare facilities have been damaged since the end of December. Mr. President, winter is worsening the already dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine. It is truly deploring that Russia is weaponizing winter again. Russia's deliberate attacks on hospitals, schools, power plants, and other critical infrastructure threaten the lives and future of the Ukrainian people. Japan condemns Russia's attacks against civilian infrastructure and cities across Ukraine in the strongest terms. We are also deeply concerned with the safety of nuclear facilities in Ukraine under the current threat. There must be no impunity for war crimes and other atrocities. Justice must be done, and those who are responsible for the undeniable atrocities must be held accountable. Our thoughts are with the people of Ukraine who are enduring this heinous war of aggression. Japan has been and will continue to stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine for as long as it takes. Ms. Kamikawa, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan, visited Ukraine last weekend and highlighted the importance of ensuring human dignity of the people of Ukraine. During her visit, Japan announced new contributions, handing over 5 mobile gas turbine generators and providing assistance in transporting 7 auto transformers. These contributions are expected to benefit an additional 5 million Ukrainian people. All innocent civilians, including women and children, must be protected. We will continue to provide our assistance. International humanitarian law provides protection for civilians. We should never forget there is an unalterable reason why all parties to the conflict must uphold international law. We will keep our call loud and clear until we see that the rules of war are respected. Mr. President, as the war persists, it is heart-wrenching to hear stories of many people, including women and children inside and outside of Ukraine, waiting to reunite with their families. Without this tragic and unprovoked war, it should have been a festive season that families could enjoy together. At the same time, Japan is deeply distressed that many children in Ukraine have been unlawfully transferred from their homes and family separation has been prolonged. We strongly condemn this heinous act by Russia. We urge Russia to immediately repatriate these children back to Ukraine. Mr. President, we once again reiterate one simple and clear fact. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a flagrant violation of the UN Charter and cannot be justified for any reason. And it goes without saying, no support should be given to a state that is violating the Charter. It is unacceptable if support is rendered in violation of existing Security Council resolutions. In this regard, we condemn in the strongest possible terms North Korea's export and Russia's procurement of ballistic missiles from North Korea, as well as Russia's use of North Korean ballistic missiles against Ukraine. In addition, we are deeply concerned about the potential for any proliferation of nuclear or ballistic missile-related technologies to North Korea. From North Korea. Any arms transfers, including that of conventional weapons and of related material and technology between North Korea and Russia, flagrantly violates multiple Security Council resolutions that Russia itself supported and could actually destabilize the region. We call on both North Korea and Russia to abide by their obligations under all relevant Security Council resolutions and immediately cease all activities that violate them. It is a totally outrageous situation that the international community is demanding the observance of Security Council resolutions by a permanent member of the Security Council. Mr. President, no matter how much Russia tries to justify its actions, it is so obvious that the civilians will not be suffering if it had not been for the war of aggression in the first place. Therefore, once again, we strongly urge Russia to withdraw immediately and unconditionally from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, for the record, we'd like to state our principled rejection of the approach adopted by the French presidency despite our objections, including inviting to this meeting delegations under Rule 37 and Rule 39. Their number, including Ukraine, is 6: EU, Italy, Poland, Estonia, Germany, and Ukraine. Also, Denmark, Greece, and Romania will be providing written comments. This is far too many delegations for a briefing, in contrast to an open debate. Aside from this, all of the aforementioned states, with the exception of Ukraine, are members of the EU. In addition, we have the EU delegation here as well. As we've stated on numerous occasions, there is no added value from these additional statements in the Security Council. These are carbon copies of the same assertions adopted by the EU and NATO. The only aim of these delegations in the Council is to rattle off these statements for domestic consumption, for the cameras, and we believe this undermines the credibility of the Security Council. We regret the fact that the French presidency is doing this, although it claims to painstakingly observe the rules of procedure of the Security Council. President, it's an open secret that today's meeting was convened by Western colleagues as a box-ticking exercise so that they cynically can execute their monthly Security Council plan on Ukraine so that they can yet again rattle off those same anti-Russian propaganda assertions, at the same time proclaiming their commitment to international humanitarian law, theatrically lamenting loss of civilian lives. And yet not all ordinary civilians are granted this kind of compassion, even of the hypocritical kind. The West impassively distinguishes between important civilians, whose lives being lost can be used to sling mud at geopolitical opponents, distinguishing between them and so-called unimportant civilians, whose lives are deemed collateral damage. At times, they're practically called just victims. This is a staggeringly cynical approach. At its core, it's purely colonial. And we've seen it many times in Africa, in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, peace-loving Gazans, Syrians, Libyans, Iraqis, Afghanis, not to mention Russian and Ukrainians, are nothing more than faceless statistics in a tally of lives lost. On the 30th of December, the regime in Kiev, egged on by British and American consultants, shelled using cluster munitions and multiple rocket launches residential neighborhoods in the Russian city of Belgorod. The main strike hit a Christmas market where there were children and their parents present. As a result, 25 people perished, including 5 children. Over 100 were injured. There were no military objects nearby. That's what Kiev was aiming for. This was a planned war crime meant to strike horror into the hearts of Russians. And yet we didn't hear any words of condolence from our Western colleagues, not one. On the contrary, some of them justified this attack. This is what the Minister of Foreign Affairs of France did. France holds the presidency in the Security Council. They said that Kiev's terrorist attack on Belgorod is an exercise of Ukraine's right to self-defense under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. It's regrettable that French diplomacy, much like Anglo-Saxon diplomacy, has sunk so low. Do you understand that this means that you bear responsibility for these war crimes? Targeted attacks on residential neighborhoods of the Russian cities of Donetsk, Belgorod, and Kursk are ongoing. What did Russia say in response? The president of the Russian Federation, President Putin, stated that Russia will not strike areas where mothers stroll with prams. He said that Russia will use high-precision weapons to target areas where decisions are taken, where there's a concentration of servicemen, of mercenaries, and other similar centers on military sites. End of quote. Russia is striking and will continue striking Ukrainian military targets and civilian and military infrastructure, which underpin Kiev's military capacity. What's very telling is Czechia's behavior. It sought to dodge responsibility for its participation in the Belgorod strike through ammunition supplies, too scared to show up to the meeting of the Security Council on the 30th of December. This is not surprising. After all, it's much harder to stand up responsibly for deaths of civilians before the international community than hiding behind other NATO members. International organizations are behaving no better than civilized democracies. They're shamefully silent, these international organizations, when we're talking about the need to condemn Kiev's flagrant crimes. We haven't heard any clear responses, save for some general remarks in response to the Belgorod terrorist attacks from the Secretariat, given that it's biased. Against this backdrop, what looks particularly cynical and hypocritical is Kiev's so-called peace formula and another meeting that's going to be held in Davos. We'd like to underscore that this pseudo-peacekeeping initiative amounts to setting Russia an ultimatum. And any discussion of the conflict without our participation is bound to fail. We know this. On our part, we're always ready to partake in negotiations, but we cannot accept the language of ultimatums. We demand that the UN Secretariat should recall that it must act in keeping with Article 100 of the UN Charter. Mr. President, Ukraine's counteroffensive has failed. This has been recognized by the ruling elites in Ukraine and by the Western political establishment. Ukrainian servicemen left on the front lines have stated this clearly. They've stated in interviews that Ukrainian politicians are trying to demonstrate to the West some progress, any progress at all. And to do this, they're throwing ordinary soldiers to the wolves like hunks of meat, and they're bearing heavy losses. The monstrous cynicism of the backers of the Kiev regime can be seen in the fact that in order to meet their cherished goal, that is ensuring Russia's strategic defeat, to achieve this, they're prepared to justify any crimes and annihilate countless numbers of Ukrainian soldiers. This is deplorable. They don't care about civilian losses either. In the last days, the head of European diplomacy, Josep Borrell, and the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs said it's necessary to broaden military assistance to Kiev and supply long-range missiles. The U.S. administration is fighting to continue providing military assistance to Kiev. They're battling it out with the Congress and with their own people, ordinary Americans. Yet it's been cynically stated that the Ukrainian armed forces are choosing their own targets. Americans and Europeans should know that these weapons are being used to hit Christmas markets, residential buildings, women, the elderly, and children. Today, Western members of the Security Council repeated the fact that the Russian military is using missiles from the DPRK in its special military operation in Ukraine. This information came from the U.S. John Kirby, an official representative of the White House, stated this a few days ago. And in fact, a representative of the Ukrainian armed forces, the Air Force specifically, said that Kiev did not have any evidence of this fact. So the U.S. seems to be spreading information that is wrong without going through the trouble of checking this beforehand. Mr. President, turning now to the humanitarian situation. We cannot but mention the efforts France and Ecuador have undertaken to remain in the formal role of penholders on Ukrainian humanitarian issues in the Security Council. There's reason to believe that against the backdrop of an escalation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where attempts are being made to wipe the entire population of the Gaza Strip off the face of the earth, with the US providing cover. Against this backdrop, there's reason to believe that today's meeting should lend moral succor to the regime in Kiev, as Kiev's growing problems on the front line are steadily fading into the background. We yet again heard mantras from Western delegations about the grave humanitarian situation in Ukraine, about problems with power as temperatures drop. And indeed, Ukraine has fallen on hard times, and we generally feel for our brother people, the Ukrainians, who are having to suffer many deprivations. These deprivations are due to the actions of their sellout leadership, which is prepared to sacrifice Ukraine's national interests and the lives of ordinary Ukrainians in order to follow directives from their Western sponsors. The West's support is the only reason the junta in Kiev remains in power. And the junta fell for generous but empty promises given by their transatlantic friends. As a result, the junta has led Ukraine into economic and political collapse, turning it into a failed state, the political system of which increasingly bears clear hallmarks of totalitarianism. The Ukrainian military, since the conflict in Donbass began in 2014, has launched attacks targeting specifically critical civilian infrastructure, specifically those providing water and heating. Moreover, medical and educational facilities are being destroyed. Over the course of 8 years in the Donbass republics, at least 50,000 civilian infrastructural sites have been destroyed or damaged. Since 2022, over 16,000 residential buildings and almost 3,500 civilian infrastructure objects, including 700 educational and over 180 medical facilities, 1,000 electrical, water, heat, and gas supply facilities have been damaged or destroyed. But these figures never make it into UN reports because the UN Secretariat is biased. Today, we heard a lot said about solidarity with Ukraine, which Western sponsors are supposedly prepared to continue supporting. And yet it would appear that ongoing support long ago became a way of subjugating the Ukrainian economy and, as a consequence, Ukraine's population. Ukraine's external debt grew to $132 billion in 2022. That's 89% of its GDP. Staggering amounts being given to Ukraine by the IMF, the EU, and Washington are pushing the country into a debt trap for decades to come. There is a company who wants to turn a profit in Ukraine, the US financial company BlackRock. And in fact, Kiev signed an agreement with BlackRock, launching a Ukrainian development fund. Under the guise of attracting private investment to the Ukrainian economy, what we're seeing is a transfer of state sovereignty to external corporate control by the world's largest investment fund. And it's worth noting that over the last decade, the number of the amount of arable land that was transferred to American agribusiness companies exceeded 4 million hectares. We hope that Ukrainians have at last understood that over the last 2 years they've been but a pawn in the confrontation between the West and Russia. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this meeting. Let me also thank Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and Director Eden Wosono for the important briefings, which are most useful. Mr. President, Sierra Leone first expressed its principled view on the conflict in Ukraine in the explanation of position after the vote on agenda item A/ES 11.2 during the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly convened under the Uniting for Peace Resolution on 28 February 2022. Sierra Leone expressed grave concern about the regrettable serious situation created in Ukraine, with ramifications for international peace and security. Sierra Leone voted and acted based on our fundamental belief in the sanctity of the United Nations Charter, its principles, and the purposes of the organization. We underscored that our action was not an endorsement of a selective application of our fundamental belief in the principles of sovereign equality of all UN member states, territorial integrity, or political independence of member states, non-interference, and a peaceful settlement of dispute. It was not meant to absolve the actions and inactions of the United Nations, particularly in addressing peace and security questions in Africa. We expressed the firm belief that there must be consistency in the application of the UN Charter in pursuit of its purposes and resorting to the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity of any member state inconsistent with the Charter cannot be accepted. Sierra Leone accordingly called for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We also called for the immediate cessation of the hostilities and urged for good faith diplomatic effort to resolve the conflict. Mr. President, it has been 23 months since the start of the conflict, which has witnessed massive civilian casualties, the displacement of millions of civilians, vulnerable groups, including children. The Security Council has been unable to act on this conflict because of the use of the veto, a scenario which implicates Article 27, Paragraph 3 of the United Nations Charter, in our view. It also validates the prevalent view on the use of the veto to further interest instead of the collective responsibility to maintain international peace and security. Sierra Leone has been consistent in expressing commitment to the Charter of the United Nations and respect for its principles and international law, including the principles of sovereign equality of all UN member states, territorial integrity, or political independence of member states, non-interference, and the peaceful settlement of dispute. It is against this background that we express serious concerns about the deteriorating security situation in Ukraine, which is a threat to life, peace, stability, and prosperity of not only the Ukrainians, but now Russian people who are directly affected, but also the entire region. We are also seriously concerned about the humanitarian crisis, which continues to inflict widespread devastation and hardship on particularly the Ukrainian population. As we have heard from OCHA, and as I've stated in this room, over 14.6 million people, about 40% of the Ukrainian population, living in Ukraine will need humanitarian assistance in 2024. Mr. President, Sierra Leone is further deeply concerned that in absence of due compliance with international humanitarian law, the prevailing concerning humanitarian situation could further deteriorate if attacks on energy and other critical infrastructure increase during the winter. The prolonged effects of the war will continue to exacerbate the already dire and fragile humanitarian conditions of vulnerable people who will require sustained support to ensure they can meet their vital needs. Women and children, as it is with most conflict, continue to be affected due to loss of income, family separation, and disruption in the provision of essential services, including education. In light of the above, Sierra Leone calls on the parties to the conflict to firstly avoid the use of air missiles and drones targeting civilians and civilian objects, especially objects that supply essential services like hospital, water, and electricity. They must ensure that civilians, including women and children, and civilian objects are protected from harm and grave violations, which is a fundamental principle under international law, in particular international humanitarian law. Secondly, we call for sustained efforts of regional and international partners to scale up critical aid needed to cover the basic needs of the affected population across Ukraine. Thirdly, we would like to emphasize that conflict only breeds destruction, suffering, and the loss of lives. To minimize this, we urge all parties to the conflict to resolve this matter through a political and diplomatic engagement that will lead to durable peace in the region. Finally, and now in the Security Council, Sierra Leone reiterates its call for full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and for the immediate cessation of the conflicts and hostilities. We urge for good faith diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict, which includes giving consideration to the legitimate concerns of all involved parties. Let me conclude by emphasizing the importance of addressing the urgent humanitarian crisis, defending the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, and emphasizing the importance of equality, equity, and consistency in the application of international law. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
President, I also thank USG De Carlo and Ms. Wazornu for their sobering and informative briefings. The Russian Federation has ended last year and started the new one by shooting over 100 missiles and drones at densely populated areas in Kiev and other major cities across Ukraine. It has killed civilians and destroyed civilian infrastructure, including residential buildings, schools, medical facilities, and life-supporting infrastructure. Over 440 towns and villages were left without electricity and water supplies. Such attacks have not only brought loss, pain, and anguish for thousands of Ukrainians during one of the coldest months of winter, but they also constitute violations of international law. Since the massive wave of attacks by Russia against Ukraine since December, the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has recorded 90 civilian deaths, including 2 children. Over 421 civilians have been injured. These heinous attacks were conducted in part using ballistic missiles and launchers procured from the Democratic Republic of Korea. We condemn these violations in the strongest terms and call for parties to fully abide with all Security Council resolutions. We once again call on Russia to abide by international humanitarian law and refrain from using weapons with wide area impact. We reiterate our resolute condemnation of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which constitutes a manifest violation of the UN Charter. We also reaffirm our long-standing and unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. President, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine continues to drastically deteriorate. The costs already paid by the Ukrainian people, as we have stated in this Council before, is unbearable. According to OHCHR, since the start of Russia's aggression, there have been more than 29,000 civilian casualties. Russia's ongoing campaign of systematic airstrikes against civilians and critical infrastructure in Ukraine must stop at once. These relentless and inhumane attacks only aim to increase human suffering and deprive Ukrainians of electricity, heating, food, medical care, and jeopardizing food security all over the globe. We stress once again the importance of security and stability in the Black Sea. Moreover, Russia has hindered humanitarian access to territories under their temporary control. Healthcare and other critical services for survivors of gender-based violence, sexual exploitation, and abuse remain out of reach for many. This has prevented the delivery of much-needed humanitarian assistance to families and children in these areas. The constant shelling and destruction are not only exposing millions of Ukrainians to the risk of death or injury, but also to other serious protection risks, including psychological distress and loss or damage of documentation, particularly affecting the most vulnerable and people from marginalized groups. Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable for waging a war of aggression and for other most serious crimes under international law, as well as for the massive damage caused by its war. On this occasion, we also salute the brave Russian women who, since November, facing intimidation and harassment, have energized a grassroots movements in various cities, demanding that mobilized soldiers return home. In closing, President, today's meeting illustrates once again the far-reaching consequences of this war. It was another stark reminder of its devastating repercussions on not just the region, but the rest of the world. Most importantly, it must unconditionally and completely withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for that statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Under Secretary General Rosemarie Di Carlo and Ms. Edem Worsonu OCHA Director for Operations and Advocacy, for the briefs provided, and recognize the presence of the representatives of Ukraine, Estonia, Germany, Italy, Poland, and the European Union. Mr. President, Guyana joins the international community in reaffirming the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and in calling for full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We deplore the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. We note with growing concern the devastating impact of the ongoing conflict on innocent civilians and critical infrastructure. International law and international humanitarian law are unambiguous when it comes to the protection of civilians and civilian objects. Guyana therefore condemns all attacks on hospitals, electricity transmission systems, food ports, gas and water supplies, and the killing of innocent civilians. Mr. President, the devastating accounts heard today of unrelenting violence, death, and destruction are cause for the gravest of concern. We share the briefers' dismay at the increasingly dire humanitarian situation in the country and the continued denial of access to people in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. We urge the parties to comply with their obligations under international law and international humanitarian law and call for full, unhindered humanitarian access, including to occupied areas. This war has so far wrought untold suffering, particularly on the Ukrainian people. From the mass destruction of cities to prolonged economic, social, and psychological impacts, the trauma and residual effects of the war will be acutely felt for years to come. Guyana is especially alarmed at the violations committed against children who have paid a particularly high price in life and limb on account of the violence meted out, especially in attacks against schools and hospitals. We maintain that every boy and girl has the right to a life without fear or want. Guyana calls for an end to attacks in infrastructure that are critical for children's well-being, including schools, hospitals, energy, water, and sanitation systems. In its latest report on the human rights situation in Ukraine, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has documented cases of arbitrary detention, torture, summary executions, sexual violence, transfers, and deportations of children, and cases of forced conscription of protected persons. Guyana demands that the parties respect humanitarian principles and adhere to international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including by ending and preventing all grave violations against children and ensuring their safe return. We welcome the efforts that led to the exchange of prisoners of war last week. We hope that these positive efforts can continue and that independent monitors, including OHCHR, will have regular, unimpeded, and confidential access to all detained persons. Mr. President, the prolongation of this war poses increasingly grave risks and consequences for all concerned and for international peace and security. It has brought nothing but unimaginable suffering and trauma for generations of Ukrainian and Russian citizens, not to mention its regional and international ramifications. We call for an immediate end to the hostilities and a complete withdrawal of Russian military forces from the territory of Ukraine. We urge the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict and the continued engagement of the international community to this end. We further call for continued international support for the victims of the war, inclusive of medical, psychological, and legal support, with particular attention to children and survivors of sexual violence. We commend the efforts of UN agencies, bilateral partners, and international, regional, and local organizations in responding to the humanitarian needs of the Ukrainian people, and urge the international community to scale up humanitarian support to Ukraine. In closing, Mr. President, I would like to stress the urgency of resolving this conflict through peaceful means. Guyana will continue to lend its support to all efforts of the United Nations Secretary General and other willing partners who have been working diligently toward peace and an end to this scourge of war. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I will now deliver a statement in my capacity as the representative of France. I should like to thank Ms. De Carlo and Ms. Vassonu for their briefings. As Ukrainians entered 2024, over 500 Russian drones and missiles rained down on them, on residential buildings, shops, churches, maternity wards, railway stations, the metro, energy infrastructure. This is what the Russian army is targeting in Ukraine. France condemns these mass strikes. By deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure, Russia continues to try and convince us that it is seeking military objectives. It is violating international humanitarian law. It's refusing access to areas under its control for humanitarian actors. It's trying to sap the morale of a nation whose identity it repudiates. It's trying to subjugate by force a country, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of which it has been denying for 10 years now. It's using weapons it's bought from Iran and DPRK in violation of decisions taken by this council. Russia is forging on regardless. The only justification for its actions it has is to restore the imperial past it dreams about so much. As the war enters its third year, let's recall something that we all know. If Russia were to end the aggression, the war would end without any damage done to its own security. Should Ukraine stop defending itself, it would lose its freedom. What's at stake is of import to all of us. The way in which we respond to Russia's aggression against Ukraine will determine our collective security. Russia must heed the calls of the General Assembly, which, through an overwhelming majority, affirmed and reaffirmed its commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. France will continue to support the Ukrainian people, unswervingly so, across all areas, allowing it to exercise its right to legitimate self-defense in keeping with the UN Charter. It will also continue supporting the Ukrainian jurisdiction and the ICC, Ukraine's efforts there to combat impunity for crimes committed by Russia. We will maintain our economic and humanitarian support to Ukraine and Ukrainians. We'll continue working to mitigate the consequences of Russia's aggression for people the world over, specifically as regards food security. Last but not least, Russia would like to support Ukraine's vision of a just and lasting peace in keeping with the fundamental principles of the Charter. I will now resume my function as President of the Council. I will now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Madam Undersecretary General, Madam Director, I also recognize here the representative of Putin's criminal regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. Her boss has cowardly extracted himself from the chamber, but there is obviously no added value in his presence other than keeping the record of his statements and testimonies for the purposes of the future tribunal of Russia war crimes. Russia persists in terrorizing Ukraine with regular missile and drone strikes. On the 8th of January, another massive attack took place. It was the third in less than 2 weeks. According to the information from the Defense Forces of Ukraine, the Russian Federation launched at least 59 units of weapons, including 8 Shahed, 7 S-3 and S-4 ballistic missiles, 4 Kinzhal air ballistic missiles fired by the MiG-31K fighters from Ryazan and Tambov, 24 Kh-101, Kh-555, Kh-55 cruise missiles fired by 11 Tu-95 MS bombers from Engels, 8 Kh-22, Kh-32 cruise missiles shelled by 2 22 M3. 6 Iskander-M ballistic missiles from the occupied Crimea, 2 Kh-31P guided anti-radar missiles shelled by tactical aviation from the Belgorod region. On that morning, Russia attacked critical infrastructure and civilian and industrial facilities across various regions of Ukraine. In particular, ballistic missiles targeted the Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Khmelnytsk regions. At least 4 people were killed and 45 were wounded as a result of these strikes. Those wounded following the Russian strikes received the necessary treatment despite the Russian forces continuing to deliberately target medical facilities. According to the Health Ministry of Ukraine, 1,501 medical facilities have been damaged and 195 completely destroyed since February 2022. Currently, 474 of these facilities have already been fully restored, while efforts to rebuild other 383 are underway. Mr. President, telling the Council about these waves of Russian missile terror, I do not mean to imply that there are calm and safe periods for Ukrainian civilians in between. Attacks occur daily, and even though they may be smaller in scope, they significantly increase the number of casualties and the amount of destruction. The delegation of Ukraine has already informed the Council in its letter circulated on the 6th of January of a horrendous crime committed by the Russian armed forces in the city of Pokrovsk, Donetsk region, and its outskirts. The strike of S-300 missiles targeted private residential buildings and resulted in the deaths of 11 local residents, including 5 children. It is a matter of alarm that, among other things, Russia maintains its capacity to harm Ukrainians from a safe distance beyond the reach of our defensive means due to the ongoing supply of weapons and munitions from rogue states. For over a year, we have consistently drawn the Council's attention to the transfer of Iranian drones to Russia in violation of the Security Council decisions. We also condemn in the strongest possible terms the DPRK export and Russia's procurement of DPRK ballistic missiles, as well as Russia's use of these missiles against Ukraine. As a country that has joined the joint statement on DPRK, Russia ballistic missile transfers, already referred to today by a number of delegations, Ukraine reiterates that these transfers are in contravention of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. According to the reports from Kharkiv prosecutor's office released on the 6th of January, one ballistic missile from the barrage that hit the city of Kharkiv on the 2nd of January was visually and technically distinct from Russian models. During the presentation of the remnants to the media, the prosecutor's office spokesperson noted deviations from standard Iskander missiles. Specifically, the missile had a slightly larger diameter than the Russian Iskander missile, and its nozzle, internal electrical windings, and rear parts are also deferred. As the spokesperson said, this missile is similar to one of the North Korean missiles. The examination of the remnants aimed at establishing and verifying the origin of the aforementioned missile is underway. Mr. President, every day you and other participants of the Security Council meetings come to listen to the language of war. It is the language in which the invaders receive the order to launch their full-scale aggression against Ukraine. It is the language that the victims hear when they are raped in front of their families. It is the language that many Ukrainian civilians hear before they are executed. As we well know, including from the writings of Leo Tolstoy, before the Bolshevik putsch, the educated nobility in Russian Empire used French rather than Russian as their household language. It was the language of Russian diplomacy before the adherents of Bolshevism, who keep their grip on the Kremlin today, came to power. I invite Moscow's envoy to avail herself, in fact, of interpretation and to keep the earphones on, since the next part of my intervention will be in French, in recognition of the contribution that France, Switzerland, and many other peace-loving countries have made to peace and security. Monsieur le Président.
President, as Russia continues to kill Ukrainian children throughout the country with its weapons, young Ukrainians who have been illegally transferred by Russia from occupied territories are submitted to another flagrant violation of their human rights by Russia. On the 4th of January 2024, Putin signed a decree defining certain categories of foreign citizens and stateless persons who have the right to request citizenship from the Russian Federation. The document sets out that orphans and children without parental protection, who are Ukrainian citizens, can obtain Russian citizenship through the personal decision of the President of the Russian Federation, regardless of the general or specific requirements of federal legislation. A request for such citizenship to be obtained can be presented by the leaders of Russian organizations within which the child is being monitored. This other normative legal act, in addition to its goal to cover the demographic needs of the aggressor country to the detriment of migrants, so as to continue its aggression against Ukraine, also violates Ukrainian legislation, norms under international law, and children's rights. These are Ukrainian citizens who have been forcibly transferred into Russian territory by the aggressor state. We reaffirm that all Ukrainian children who have been forcibly transferred into Russian territory under the pretext of humanitarian protection remain Ukrainian citizens. We call on the International Criminal Court to take note of these actions by the Russian leaders to transfer Ukrainian children from one national group to another, notably by forcibly giving them Russian citizenship. This is one of the manifestations of genocide. We call on the international community to execute the arrest warrant issued by the ICC against Vladimir Putin as soon as possible. President, according to experts' calculations, military and economic experts, the cost of the Russian aerial attacks against Ukraine on the 30th of December and the 2nd of January were some $1.27 billion and $620 million at least, respectively. One would imagine that Monday's attack also cost Russia several $million as well. At a time when Russia is spending billions to destroy Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, its own critical infrastructure is collapsing or falling into disrepair. Tens of thousands of inhabitants in cities around Moscow, such as Podolsk, Kolomna, and Balashika, have been left to their fate. Without heating, people are freezing in their homes in sub-zero temperatures. And as Putin's envoy in this chamber claims to be aware of what is going on and circulating on Ukrainian social media, I would recommend that he, from his warm, comfortable Manhattan apartment, take a look at the messages written by the inhabitants in his own capital and its outskirts. People are literally living in apartments that are covered in ice, and they are burning wood in the roads to survive. Experts are warning about the potential domino effects of the weaknesses in Russia's infrastructure. Nevertheless, the Kremlin regime seem not to be bothered about resolving the problems of their own citizens. They remain obsessed by a suicidal and senseless war, trying to kill as many Ukrainians as possible until it inevitably collapses. Let us not forget that the Kremlin is not just killing Ukrainians, but also Russians. Hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens have already paid with their life for Putin's maniacal dreams. These are not just generations of present Russians, but also future generations who will suffer from these decisions. If Putin can win any prize, it would be in a competition of Russophobes, because nobody as much as him has compromised Russia's future prospects and the prospects of its people. With Hitler and Stalin, he is primarily responsible for the thousands of deaths taking place every day in Russia. Whether it's on the battlefields of a crazy war, or the continued dramatic deterioration in people's living standards, the propagation of diseases, alcoholism, and drug addiction. According to the conclusions of some researchers from Yale University into the sanctions against Russia, and I quote, "Russia is no longer close to being an economic power and has deleted the minimal declaration of statistics on a minimum income which is required to be a member of the IMF. Putin's Russia simply survives by seizing assets. The economy is increasingly dominated by the state, which is devouring its own companies to feed Putin's war machine. It is therefore in the world's interest to put an end to this criminal regime and to bring about comprehensive, fair and lasting peace in Ukraine. We encourage all peace-loving states to commit to a process to implement the peace formula plan, and in particular to participate in the 4th meeting of National Security Advisors on the peace formula for Ukraine, which will be held on Sunday, the 14th of January, in Davos in Switzerland. The peace formula has become a platform and an international structure for peace to restore international law and the multilateral security architecture. Lasting and fair peace can only be possible when we work together, and our work must be based on the founding charter, the UN Charter. Thank you very much.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, distinguished briefers, members of Security Council, I will be brief. At the turn of the year, towards the end of the second year of the war, Ukraine experienced the largest wave of the Russian missile attacks on its civilian infrastructure since the beginning of the aggression. Those barbaric and cynical assaults, as well as attempts to impose a naval blockade of Ukraine, clearly demonstrate Russia's resolve to plod along the path of terror and destruction. Moscow seems to be convinced that it can outlast the Ukrainian resistance and resilience to defend its people and its territory. Therefore, it's our primary task to prove the Russian aggressors wrong by continuing our support to Ukraine for as long as it takes. Poland has done it so since the very beginning of the war, and will continue on this path, as it was duly reconfirmed during yesterday's telephone conversation between the presidents of Poland and Ukraine, as well as by the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs during his very first visit, foreign visit in office to Kiev just a few days ago. The choice of the minister's destination was a symbolic emphasis of the priority role that Ukraine plays in the Polish foreign policy, as well as Poland's readiness to further actively support Ukraine's European and Euro-Atlantic aspirations. Mr. President, the representatives of free world cannot afford to be fatigued with the war in Ukraine. As Minister Sikorski stressed, the only country that could feel as exhausted after the 23 months of constant oppression is Ukraine itself. But instead, it bravely stands against the unrelenting forays of Russian imperialism. So must we. As long as Russia remains committed to the further destabilizing global security architecture, we should continue to exert pressure on the aggressor while supporting the victim. Not only must we maintain the current levels of military and financial support to Ukraine, we actually need to do our best to increase it. Poland is currently discussing with Ukraine new forms of such support. Let us not forget, should Ukraine falter, the risk of Russian next aggressions against new countries would rise dramatically. Should Ukraine prevail, the peace and the UN values will be restored. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, therefore, The stakes of the war in Ukraine are very high. Let us not forget that Russia openly admits that the war is not only about Ukraine. It's about imposing the new world order, which in fact disregards the very core principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, namely sovereignty and territorial integrity, and humanitarian law. So without the just peace in Ukraine, there is no chance for a lasting peace based on international law to which all members of this organization should adhere. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President.
We start by congratulating the new members of this council, Algeria, Guyana, Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, and Slovenia. We appreciate your commitment to contribute to strengthening international peace and security. Mr. President, Russia, we all witness it, is continuing its illegal war of aggression at full force. The recent massive bombardments directly target civilians even far from the front line. Besides drones from Iran, Russia fired for the first time ballistic missiles produced by North Korea. The transfer of these weapons constitutes a direct violation of binding Security Council resolutions that Russia itself voted for. To exercise its legitimate right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, Ukraine relies on international support. We have taken lead role in the supply of air defense systems. They directly contribute to saving lives. At the same time, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine remains dire, and Germany has contributed more than 403 million euros of humanitarian assistance. Besides the delivery of basic goods, we focus on the provision of mental health services, winterization, as well as demining activities. Colleagues, Russia's unjustifiable war affects us all. We must not allow attacks on sovereign countries and neo-colonial attempts to grab their land. An aggressor must never prevail. That being said, what can the international community do to end this tragedy? First, we must press the aggressor to cease its unlawful invasion. The GA resolutions and the ICJ's provisional measures must be implemented. Second, we must support Ukraine in defending itself, as long as the aggression continues. Third, we must create a foundation for a just and lasting peace. President Zelensky's peace formula clearly outlines a viable way forward. Finally, perpetrators of war crimes must be held accountable. In closing, we once again call on Russia to immediately and unconditionally cease all its military operations and to withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the European Union.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Permettez-moi.
Thank you, President. Allow me first of all to congratulate France for its presidency of the Council, and I wish you the best of success.
To speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino, align themselves with this statement. Mr. President, for the people of Ukraine, 2023 ended and 2024 began with massive Russian missile and drone attacks on civilians and critical infrastructure in the midst of winter. As it unsuccessfully attempted last winter, Russia aims to destroy the morale and resilience of the Ukrainian people. In late December and early January, it carried out the largest strikes since the start of its aggression. The EU condemns the intensification of Russia's campaign of systematic airstrikes against civilian targets and critical infrastructure in Ukraine. We reiterate the need to protect civilians, an obligation of all UN member states. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has confirmed that more than 10,000 civilians have been killed in Ukraine and more than 18,500 injured since Russia launched its full-scale invasion. The true toll is probably substantially higher. In this regard, we also condemn the continued military support for Russia's war of aggression provided by Iran, Belarus, and the DPRK. And we continue to urge all countries not to provide weapons and military equipment. including missiles and drones, or other support for Russia's war of aggression. We urge the DPRK and Russia to abide by the successive UN Security Council resolutions, which clearly prohibit any arms exports or imports involving the DPRK. We also remain very concerned about the situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and Russia's refusal to grant IAEA monitors access to the plant's reactors. Russia must urgently withdraw from the ZNPP and return control to its legitimate owner, Ukraine. Humanitarian access remains critical, and we call on Russia to ensure safe and impeded humanitarian access to all areas under its temporary military control. The negative consequences of Russia's aggression are not limited to Ukraine. Russia's deliberate attacks on Ukraine's grain storage and export facilities, as well as its actions to hinder the freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, show it continues to weaponize food and deliberately undermines global food security. I stress the importance of security and stability in the Black Sea, which is vital for sustainable food exports to global markets, and particularly to countries most in need. Mr. President, there can be no impunity. Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable for waging a war of aggression against Ukraine and for other most serious crimes under international law, as well as for the massive damage caused by its war. The EU encourages further efforts to establish a tribunal for the prosecution of the crime of aggression against Ukraine that would enjoy the broadest cross-regional support and legitimacy, and a future compensation mechanism. We reiterate our support for the work of the International Criminal Court and condemn Russia's continued attempts to undermine its independence, international mandate, and functioning. We also recall the legally binding order of the International Court of Justice of March 2022 for Russia to immediately suspend its military operations in Ukraine. Finally, the EU supports all meaningful efforts to bring an end to Russia's war. The path to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace is for the aggressor to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine and respect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The UN General Assembly has stated this very clearly in successive resolutions. The EU will continue its global outreach to ensure the widest possible international support for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, and the key principles and objectives of Ukraine's peace formula, with a view to a global peace summit with the broadest possible participation. The meeting of national security advisors in Davos in a few days is the next important step. The recent large-scale prisoner exchange demonstrates the scope for confidence-building measures, and we welcome the facilitating role played by the UAE. Mr. President, I reaffirm the EU's unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, as well as its inherent right of self-defense. We will continue to support Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the European Union for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 3 Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. We also align ourselves with the statement delivered by the European Union. Thank you for convening today's briefing. I thank the briefers and also warmly welcome all the new members of the Security Council. Mr. President, as many others have said, Russia has started 2024 where it left off last year, by unleashing death and destruction in Ukraine. Starting from the 29th of December, Russia initiated what could be considered the most extensive missile and drone strike against Ukraine since the onset of the large-scale war, deploying a total of 500 missiles and drones specifically intended to target high-density residential areas and critical infrastructure, including homes, schools, water systems, power plants, and hospitals. Since the beginning of the war, over 1,300 attacks on healthcare facilities have been reported by the WHO in Ukraine. The Russian representative tries very hard to come up with absurd claims by stating that the damage is caused by Ukrainian air defense systems, at the same time repeatedly failing to address why Russia even launches missiles which threaten lives of innocent civilians of another sovereign country in the first place. Mr. President, we also condemn Iran and the DPRK, who are providing weapons and ammunition to Russia in its indiscriminate war against Ukraine. We once again reiterate our call for a UN investigation on the weapon transfers and a report to the UN Security Council. Our countries have also joined the joint statement, which was mentioned before. Mr. President, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania have altogether contributed over $100 million worth of humanitarian aid to the people of Ukraine, and we will continue to support Ukraine until the aggressor is defeated. I would also like to acknowledge the efforts of the UN Humanitarian Coordinator for Ukraine, Ms. Denise Brown, and her leadership on the winter response plan. In conclusion, the sharp increase of Russia's attacks demonstrate that their criminal goals have not changed. We call upon Russia to respect the calls of the international community, voiced in relevant General Assembly resolutions, calling for immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of Russian military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. In the interest of time, we will send the full statement after the meeting. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President. Italy fully aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. I would like to add some considerations in its national capacity. Today, almost 2 years after Russia's full-scale, unprovoked, unjustifiable and illegal invasion of Ukraine, we stand together with the Ukrainian people, more united than ever, to reaffirm our unwavering commitment to our shared values based on the rules-based multilateral order as recognized in the UN Charter. Italy condemns in the strongest possible way Russia's continuous brutal attacks targeting civilian infrastructures and cities across Ukraine, as well as Russia's complete disregard to the call rising from the entire membership to put an end to its invasion of Ukraine. Russia will have to be accountable for war crimes and the heavy damages caused by its war of aggression. Assistance to Ukraine has been a priority for Italy since the beginning of the conflict and throughout 2023. Our country has provided more than 2 billion euros in aid, including humanitarian support and reception measures for refugees from Ukraine. Italy fully supports the humanitarian actors who are working tirelessly to ensure the protection of the population. Rapid, safe, and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance for those in need in Ukraine must be guaranteed. As current chair of the Mine Action Support Group, Italy is particularly proud of the broad engagement of the international community together with the UN to support the swift demining of the territory in order to prevent further humanitarian impact, especially on children, and sustain Ukrainian agriculture to the benefit of global food security. Mr. President, we are committed to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Political, military, and economic support for Ukraine is one of the key priorities of our G7 presidency, and we are determined to continue doing so as long as necessary to reach a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace. In conclusion, Italy intends to play an active role in the reconstruction and social and economic recovery of Ukraine. A bilateral conference on the reconstruction of Ukraine was organized in Rome in April 2023, while in 2025 we will host the Ukraine Recovery Conference. Together we will lay the foundations for a prosperous, independent Ukraine within our common European family. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Italy for his statement. There are no further speakers inscribed on the list. The meeting is adjourned.